Hi, everyone. Hopefully this is all working okay. And hopefully everyone's having a good day so far, especially after that really wonderful keynote that we just heard. I get to introduce myself, I guess, so that's kind of fun. My name is Adam McLain. I recently graduated back in May of last year from Harvard Divinity School with a Master's of Theological Studies, and I focused my study on women, gender, sexuality, and religion. But really, I filled around all over the university because it's Harvard, so you got to enjoy it. I got my undergrad at Brigham Young University in literature, so my main emphasis and love in academia is literature. Um, and there I helped out with L2E while I was there, and I was also managing editor for Leading Edge there for 3 years. And so I have a good, I think a decent history, not a long one, but a good one in Latter-day speculative fiction and Mormonism and SF. So today's presentation is going to have 3 different parts to it. I apologize as well if I'm continually looking down because my notes are down there. So it's going to have 3 parts. The first is going to outline some of the parts of a working paper that's titled A Critical Introduction to Latter-day Speculative Fiction. Like Eugene England, Richard Cracroft, Bruce W. Jorgensen, Gideon Burton, Michael Austin, Jack Harrell, and many others, I would like to provide the academic world, but also the science fiction and other worlds with an introductory paper that encourages future engagement and generates more scholarship on Mormonism, Latter-day Saints, literature, and SF. A brief comment on those terms at the beginning here. When I use Mormon and Latter-day Saint, I use them sometimes interchangeably because I'm looking at the more broader Mormon diaspora, not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but the other churches that make up Mormonism broadly, and the other movements, the other cultures, the other literatures. It's not as broad a diaspora as other religions and cultures, but it is a diaspora in itself, being the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints may be the majority among that, but they are not the complete voice on what Mormonism is and what Mormonism can be. So the second part then, and then also for a comment on terms, the term SF for me does not mean just science fiction. It means mostly speculative fiction, as in the title, but that could mean anything from fantasy to science fiction to horror. The definition in the term is very broad. The history of SF in and of itself has been a very large, long argument over what science fiction is, what SF is. But generally when I'm using it, when I'm soliciting people for essays, especially for the edited collection that we'll talk about later, I use it in the broadest of sense, just as I use Mormonism and Latter-day Saint in the broadest of sense. The second part of the presentation, after I go over just some brief history of Mormon literary criticism and speculative fiction criticism. The second part is going to introduce an essay collection that I was asked to edit and solicit essays for, which is going to be published in a special issue of the Science Fiction Research Association's journal, SFRA Review, on Mormonism and SF, where we are collecting short essays, just 2,000 to 3,000 words from people on that intersection of Mormonism and SF. That's really hopefully the main part of this. I'm hoping to go quickly through the presentation and then open it up to people who have questions about that edited collection, because I'm hoping to be able to get a robust amount of essays that can engage in that intersection of Mormonism and SF that I know many of us are living in or also interested in. So that, again, that final part of the presentation is a Q&A. Throughout the presentation, if you have a question, just write it in the comments in the Discord server, and we'll pick them up at the end. And I'll also have my email and social media at the end of the presentation so that you can email me a question if you have that, or if you want to also meet with me over something to discuss your abstract or your essay or any ideas on Mormonism and science fiction. We can talk together and just have a good time. To begin then, I'm going to talk us through some of the paper that I'm working on, which hopefully will be an introduction of sorts to this edited collection, which is a critical introduction to Latter-day Saint science fiction, or Latter-day speculative fiction, as I call it. So the first part of this is going to go over the Mormon literary history, which is the history of the criticism and the theory around it, not specifically the books that Mormons wrote, but the articles and presentations that were given around the literature and the academic conversation that occurred. And then I'm going to go briefly into the Mormon and SF, the criticism and the theory part of that, and look at specifically within this. I'm looking at first the history as related by Eugene England, and then an argument that occurred in Mormon literature that is still occurring today, and then an argument that happened at the intersection of Mormonism and SF to give an example basically of what conversations we can have and what conversations we need to have as we try to broaden and engage critically more with the texts that we love. So since I am a literary scholar, my training tends toward literary criticism and theory. The best way to begin an engagement with the intersection of Mormonism and SF is to consider the history of Latter-day Saint and Mormon literary criticism. To do this, I'm first turning to Eugene England, who argued that Mormon literature covers 4 broad periods, and then I'm going to delve into that conversation between Richard Krakoff, Bruce Jorgensen, and Gideon Burton. So Eugene England was a giant in the history of Mormon literary criticism. He was a professor of literature who began Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, which was a place to cultivate faithful yet critical fiction, poetry, and essays about Mormonism. He published many collections of Mormon writers and wrote on Mormon literature throughout his career. And the 2 articles in the one book that are listed on the presentation, these affected a lot the trajectory of Mormon letters, as England in them attempted to map the literary history of Mormonism. And to do this, he grouped it into 4 different periods, into 4 literary periods. The first was the Foundations period, which he set from 1830 to 1880, which was 50 years in which he focused in on the Brighamite sect, which was the one that left Nauvoo and came to Utah, that formed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as we know it today. According to England, the selection of literature for the Foundations was largely unsophisticated writing, expressive of the new converts' dramatic, symbolic, as well as literal journeys to Zion and their fierce rejection of Babylon, and was often intended to meet practical needs of the church. A lot of this was diaries and tracts and things like that that allowed them to set a foundation for what would come forward in theological engagements and things like that. The next was home literature, which he set from 1880 to 1930, which was literature that lifted up Mormonism within Utah and within itself. He considers this literature to be, quote, highly didactic fiction and poetry designed to defend and improve the saints, but of little lasting worth, and also the refining of Mormon theological and historical writing. It seemed like England, at least, did not really like home literature as much as others may, and others who find the little secrets and tidbits in that. To define the next period of literature in the history of Mormon letters, England turned the work of Edward Geary, who considered writers in this generation to be part of the lost generation, much like the 20s and 30s American expatriate writers like Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Ernest Hemingway and others. England considered these writers to be a, quote, reaction to the loss of the heroic pioneer vision and a decline into provincial materialism, which impelled an outpouring of excellent but generally critical works. These were works from people who were England saw as outside of the central Mormonism. They were people who left Utah, who left the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints specifically for England study, to write away from that in order to write back to it as well. And then in the final period that England set up, that was contemporary to him, he called it Faithful Realism, which is from the 1960s to his present, which when he published was 2001. In this, he gave an optimistic and glowing review of the literature that he says this period is saying that the period was highlighted with, quote, good work in all genres, combining the best qualities and avoiding the limitations of most past work, so that it was both faithful and critical. The 4 periods that England situates are important because and within those periods, England brings forth SF authors like Orson Scott Card and others to look at Mormon literature broadly. He subsumes more SF into that Mormon literature rather than looking at it in and of itself. And so we have to, when looking at Mormonism and SF academically, we have to understand that we are working through a Mormon literary history, an SF history, and then we're looking at them as they interact and combine with each other. While the connection between Mormon literature and SF literature will always exist, we have yet, from what I could tell, we have yet from what I can tell, to produce a robust analysis of literary periods in the history of Mormonism and SF specifically. Most recently, Liz Busby put together a fantastic 5-part blog article series on the history of Mormon SF on the Association of Mormon Letters. It was still a blog article and not quite an academic article that could usher in a periodic thing. And if you are interested in the history of Mormonism and FS and SF, Busby's article is a great place to start. Instead, in this, these periods of literature, specifically to England, we saw, as I mentioned, Mormon SF was subsumed into Mormon literature, where he was using these SF authors to make his arguments about Mormon literature more broadly, and he never focused in on SF particularly, which is what I would always like to do, since I love SF more than other literature. I still love other literature too. One of the main questions for literary, media, and cultural criticism is what criteria should be used to determine if this item can be included or excluded. In other words, basically, criticism asks, what is the merit of an item, or how does an item relate to others like it? Criticism allows us to argue and look deeper at a piece of media item, in literature. The terms media, item, and literature used broadly throughout this presentation in order to determine what it is and how it affects other people and ourselves. One of the big questions that has haunted Mormon letters is what criteria should be used to determine a book to be Mormon literature. The section that I'm going to go into now is briefly outlining arguments from 3 different scholars and a trend of thinking on how to define what Mormon literature is. Because in dealing with SF, we're also dealing with this haunting of this question that is always around Mormon literary criticism of what is it and who can determine it and how is it determined to be such. The first, so in 1990, Richard Krakoff, who was a literature professor at BYU, I believe, reviewed Harvest Contemporary Mormon Poems, in which he analyzed a poem about a Latter-day Saint ritual and deemed it to be non-Mormon. Even though this poem was written by a Latter-day Saint, focused on a Latter-day Saint ordination, specifically the Aaronic priesthood and the ordination to it, and was published by a Latter-day Saint press, Krakoff deemed this poem to be, quote, a competent, earthbound, non-Mormon poem. Earlier in the review, Krakoff describes, quote, earthbound as something that, quote, represses and replaces soaring spirituality with earthbound humanism. Krakoff's strong words and determination of what is and is not Mormonism set up a long-term discussion spanning decades over what and who could define Mormonism and Mormon literature. Defending his views of an quote-unquote authentic Mormon voice, Krakoff delivered to the Association of Mormon Letters an address titled Attuning the Authentic Mormon Voice, Stemming the Sophic Tide in LDS Literature. In his address, Krakoff relies on Hugh Nibley's separation of mantic Mormons, those who believe in the supernatural parts of Mormonism, and Sophic Mormons, those who strive to make the supernatural understandable. In the use of this binary, Krakoff attempts to show that he believes that the mantic view is the authentic voice of Mormonism, one that accepts and relates full-heartedly this thing considered quote-unquote orthodox theology, even though it is never defined what is kept in with the orthodox and what is left out with the heresy. And then he excommunicates the Sophic Mormons as inauthentic, non-Mormon, earthbound humanists. Mormon literature for Krakoff is, quote, right-thinking, red blood, and sanctified Latter-day Saints, writing literature and writing books that reflect what he saw as the coreness of Mormonism. Krakoff's very strong words led Bruce W. Jorgensen to respond to him, specifically respond to the review, which Jorgensen responded to in this presentation, and then Krakoff responded in his own Association of Mormon Letters presidential address. So we had this fun little infighting among Mormon literary critics. So Jorgensen titled his presidential address, To Tell and Hear Stories, Let the Stranger Say. Jorgensen's address was a response to Krakoff's review of Harvest, and Krakoff and others, Jorgensen saw Mormon letters shoring itself up within its own walls, keeping precious what is within Mormonism while spurning what is without. That worried Jorgensen because that meant that along with all the good that is kept within the walls, the bad was also kept within the walls. There was no purification of of Mormonism per se. He saw that the best cure for this was to reach out to the stranger, allow them to help root out the darkness that festered in any commune, the dirt that accumulates, and cleanse the temple with the interaction and relationship with the other. He didn't want to quite define Mormon literature because that would then be excommunicant of other people. So he offered two takes on Mormon criticism. The first was to be generous and hospitable. The second was to be patient, long-suffering, and kind. In these two lofty goals, Jorgensen saw Mormon criticism enacting Mormon charity, whereas Krakow sought Mormon criticism to enact Mormonism itself. A few years later, from the 90s, at the end of that decade in 1999, Gideon Burton, in an essay delivered in a 1994 conference, but then published in an edited collection on Mormon literature for dialogue, uses the Restoration as a metaphor to approaching Mormon literature, Mormon literary criticism, and bridge between Krakow and Jorgensen. He states that if we will view both literature and criticism within the larger context of the Restoration, then the two positions which Krakow and Jorgensen represent, fidelity to the Mormon ethos and openness to otherness, become complementary and mutually interdependent necessities, an adventure so significant it cuts across lines of Mormon membership, affecting a Zion culture. This thrust towards Zionism, a culture of one heart and one mind, allows Burton to contradict and combine both Krakow and Jorgensen by seeing benefits in both. One cannot recognize oneself until one has interacted with a stranger, while at the same time, knowing yourself can benefit your interaction with the stranger. Burton views Mormon literature as something that, quote, will always change so long as a literature living up to its potential for furthering the restoration, a restoration that is continually happening. So for Burton, he sees literature as continuing to happen and continuing to forward the idea of what is Mormon literature and what is that. And so we can never define it because that definition would put it in relation to the contemporary time period. So there have also been other conversations around this from Michael Austin, Jack Harrell, Richard Rust, and others, and they've engaged with the history of Mormon criticism. But for the sake of brevity, I've focused on these three people and drawn a chain of them asking, what is Mormon literature? How do we define this Mormon literature? Who do we define it as? And to look at these broader questions that are important to understanding not only Mormon literature, but also the intersection of Mormon literature, Mormonism itself, and SF. Since Mormon and Latter-day Saint writers and creators of SF fit into this literary history and this literary criticism. Specifically, I don't have time to delve into the theory-wise of stuff, but one of the questions that I brought out from literary theory with Mormonism is how can we use Mormonism as a tool with which to theorize? So along with the earlier question of what defines Mormon literature and that argument, we can use these two things and these two questions to look at Mormonism and SF specifically. Specifically, I see in the theorization and criticalness that the two questions that haunt Mormon studies also haunt the intersection of Mormonism and SF. For example, what is Mormonism and what is SF? Who can be a part and not a part of it? Must someone be, as Krakow argued, a quote-unquote orthodox, whatever orthodoxy is, Mormon in order to write Mormon literary criticism, in order to write Mormon literature as well? The same questions haunt SF and have indeed cannot be exercised from it. For example, what is SF? Who is allowed to write SF? Or, in other words, who is accepted into the community of SF and who dismisses the community of SF? And who does the community itself dismiss? These questions arise as we deal with this intersection. So I wanted to also briefly in this presentation touch on the history of Mormon and SF criticism and theory, which I'm going to do through outlining a brief confrontation between Michael R. Collins and Sandy and Joe Staubhar in the 80s. There's not a lot of articles that have been written on Mormonism and SF and that intersection between them, but this shows one of the fruitful ways in engaging in it. Specifically, in the 1980s, Collins firmly laid out his view that Mormonism and science fiction are antithetical on the basis of prophetic revelation. As much as science fiction predicted the future, it would fundamentally undermine Mormon prophetic revelation in his article, Refracted Visions in Future. And as much as Mormons believed in prophetic revelation, it would fundamentally undermine science fiction projections, that belief that science fiction is meant to project what a future might be. To this point, Collins published an article titled Refracted Visions in Future Worlds, in which he showed how many science fiction texts stereotyped and caricatured Mormons, from Robert Heinlein to Pierce Anthony. This article that he wrote, based on what I can tell to be an unpublished manuscript that was presented and that the Staubhars, who I'm going to talk about in the next slide, reacted to, argued that, quote, science fiction or religion, and Mormonism in particular, seem essentially incompatible. One asks the question while the other answers them. Collins then saw that, quote, in order to assimilate science fiction, Mormonism seems either to subordinate the fictive forms to the larger purposes of salvation and alter the genre into something else, like a parable, or to entertain momentarily and imaginatively perspectives drawn from other worlds. And so Collins himself saw that Mormonism and SF, at least in the 80s at the time when what was being published, couldn't quite interact as fruitfully as perhaps one might want. However, in Sunstone in 1981, the Staubhars reacted to Collins' earlier version of that article, which made the same argument, and rebuked him, and rebuked that view that Mormonism and SF cannot align well. They reacted to his praise specifically of Orson Scott Card with this article called Science Fiction and Mormonism, A Three-Way View. In it, they lauded the potentiality of science fiction, considering it the, quote, perfect milieu for new explorations of these ancient philosophical and religious questions, precisely because the canvas is blank when the author begins. They saw SF as a chance to paint the capital R version of religion, the theology, the soteriology, the eschatology, and the cosmology, along with other factors of religion, onto a different world and thus interrogate it in a new way. Quote, at the very least, science fiction has afforded us a good many hours of harmless entertainment, sometimes mind-stretching, sometimes not, they wrote. And at the most, it has offered us some moments of transcendent spiritual joy, as well as more concrete food for thought in the transcendental vein. The Staubhars' approach was different than Collins' approach against stereotypical depictions of Mormonism and SF and the antitheticalness of it because of revelation and truth. Instead, the Staubhars saw it as a potentiality of what could come in an engagement of that without the stressors of, culture and everything that surrounds just engaging with the religion itself. So within these two are depicted a dialogue that has been seen throughout the years in Mormonism and SF. What is SF to be used for when it comes to the gospel and to the church that purports to be the one truth? Yet SF obviously is fiction. Like the questions of what is Mormon literature and how can we use Mormonism when looking at literature, we can ask the same of Mormonism and SF. What is at the intersection? What can it be used for? Who is able to use it and for what purposes? And how does the future reflect the contemporary problems within theology and culture? In other words, how does the SF that is written by Latter-day Saints and by Mormons engaging with and critically looking at contemporary problems within Mormonism? So the intersection of Mormonism and SF welcomes itself to more than literature and media. Throughout the presentation so far, I've been focusing on literature since that is my emphasis and my focus. But I want to touch briefly on longer forms of literary engagement along with anthropology in an article that was published just recently last year. So the first one is Michael R. Collins' full-length book, which takes Orson Scott Card and looks at it critically in The Image of God, Theme, Characterization, and Landscape in the Fiction of Orson Scott Card that came out in the 90s. In it, Collins reiterates some of his beliefs from the article, but then he also engages deeply with Orson Scott Card as how he reads him and things like that. And we have only a limited amount of book-length analyses of wonderful authors that are in the Mormon diaspora within SF. And literature itself allows us to see not only what the author might have been affected by Mormonism within it, but sometimes what the author is questioning in their own theology and things like that. Then there's also the anthropology that I was talking about. For example, in John Bielecki's 2020 article titled Future Day Saints, Abrahamic Astronomy, Anthropological Futures, and Speculative Religion, which I think was published in the journal Religions. In this, Bielecki, who's not a member of the Latter-day Saint, has been looking at the I think it's the Mormon transhumanist movement, and specifically looking at it anthropologically. And he uses the book that just came out, Future Day Saints, to understand the ideas that can be speculated in SF, but also the ideas that can be speculated within other things that aren't literature, like groups that look to the future and things that look to what is going to happen soon and things like that. So within Mormonism and SF, there are different ways to engage with this intersection. There's literature, as I was saying, with Michael R. Collins, and there's also anthropology, and I'm sure there are others with media studies, film studies, music even, fan studies, and multiple ways to get at this intersection. All of that really was just to set up this introduction to this collection that I'm editing, as I announced at the beginning. In 2020, I was asked by then editor Sean Gines of SFRA Review to put together an edited collection for the journal. An edited collection for them entails a collection of essays on a certain topic. Sean asked me if I could focus on the intersection of Mormonism and SF. Since I accepted to do that, I hope you can tell that I firmly reject Collins' argument that SF and Mormonism are antithetical on the basis of revelation. I believe for SF, like Frederick Jamison, that SF is not meant to predict a future, thus becoming incompatible with the prophetic drive, but SF reflects and speculates on contemporary and eternal questions. Eternal here meaning questions asked throughout human history, and so they feel innate and universal to the human experience, and broader theological questions about cosmology, theophany, teleology, soteriology, eschatology, and belief in doctrine itself, to name just a few. SF, in my summation, is the perfect medium to engage with one's religion, just as one's religion is the perfect lens by which to look at SF. And I'm hoping that this edited collection will be able to introduce new ways of doing that and new ways of viewing SF and Mormonism. Specifically, just as a brief introduction, the Science Fiction Research Association is the oldest professional association dedicated to scholarly inquiry into science fiction and the fantastic across all media. They usually hold a yearly conference that brings together most or all of the academics who are studying science fiction, and they're a very tight-knit group that if you are interested in the academic engagement of science fiction, they're wonderful to follow with their email lists and their social media. Specifically, the SFRA Review publishes 4 times a year, and it publishes reviews, articles, and updates from the SFRA since 1971. For an edited collection, it makes a special issue within it, and so it makes certain pages that are in the PDF format and online. If you look at sfrareview.org, you'll see that they are moving to an online HTML format while also still producing the PDF version. Specifically, the call for papers for the Mormonism and SF collection is looking for essays that are roughly 2,000 to 3,000 words long that interrogate, analyze, and critique Mormonism and SF. Some topic ideas that I threw out at the very beginning when I was coming up with this, but I'm not, I'm open to really any ideas, were early Mormonism in 19th century SF, representation of Mormons and Latter-day Saints in SF, as you'll see here, the picture from The Expanse, where there are Latter-day Saints within that story and how they are representative. SF texts, of course, by Mormon and Latter-day Saint authors, the history of Mormon fantasy and science fiction institutions, LTUE being one of those. Along with Mormon theology, reading it as though it were SF, or reading SF as though it were Mormon theology, and interacting on that more theoretical lens with both the theology and the genre. As far as a timeline for when I'm wanting things due, their abstracts due the 1st of March, which is in about half a month. An abstract, if you don't know, is roughly a 250 to 30 word preview or summary of the essay you would like to write. It is not saying that you've already written the article or the essay. It is saying, you know, this is what I want to write, or this is what I'm hoping to write about, which should be emailed to me by March 1st. And then the 15th of March is when we'll notify of a preliminary acceptance, with drafts due 2 months later on the 15th of May, edits returned in a month, and then revisions needed back a month later so that we can publish in early August. So it's a short timeline, but the 2,000 to 3,000 words isn't too long, I hope. as far as that, I'm opening up to questions and answers now. Question and answer moment now. There's my email if you want to email me, and my social media account if you want to interact on there, or on Facebook, or on anything that you feel comfortable with. As I said at the beginning, I'm open after this to, if you email me, to set up a time where we can talk, or we can just talk through email, talking specifically through a video chat service or something like that, so that we can talk more about this intersection and about your ideas for articles and things like that. So do we have any questions? No questions so far. Okay, that's okay. um, okay, sweet. I will just wait and look at myself in the camera.
Okay, here's a question.
Yeah.
Jeff asks, what are your top 5 Latter-day Saint books? I assume that's favorite.
For Latter-day Saint literature, or like books about Latter-day Saints?
I would say literature.
For literature. I honestly have not read a lot of Latter-day Saint literature specifically, because I read more of the SF stuff.
Okay.
But I love, for example, on the SF side, I love, of course, Brandon Sanderson and Shannon Hale. Their work with religion and gender are both very interesting to me. Yeah, they're the two favorites for me for them.